All righty. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've got 20 people joining our lecture today, and I think we'll probably have a few more log in our first couple of minutes here. First and foremost, I want to say good afternoon and welcome, and thank you for spending some time with us today. You know, Florida Oceanographic Society does a lot of these outreach type lectures throughout the community. We run our lecture series in January, February, and March. We're at condo association meetings and homeowner association meetings and men's and women's clubs regularly. We go into schools quite often. So this is just one more opportunity for us to use a different type of technology to communicate some of our science and restoration and conservation work with all of you. And hopefully this will go smoothly. And I do want to tell you, if this goes well, which we're assuming it will, we plan on doing these lectures more often. So please stay in touch with us. We'll let you know when we schedule the next one, but I anticipate that sometime in the next week or two, we'll make an announcement about upcoming lectures. The next one that I want to do is focused on Florida's water issues with an emphasis on our algae blooms. So if today goes well, which it will, you guys will be able to tune in for some future lectures as we navigate this new way of reaching out to our community. Now, before we get started on the actual presentation, I just want to go through some bookkeeping, or housekeeping rather. For the time being, we have all of you muted. That way there's no background noise. And hopefully that'll work out throughout the whole presentation. We want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. I should be visible to you off on the right side of your computer screen right now. And the PowerPoint should be on the left side. If for some reason you can't see me, go up to the top. There should be a view options tab. And under that, you can select side-by-side view, and that will give you a nice split screen. Now, we're using two different ways of communicating back to me today. During our talk, I'm going to have questions for all of you, and I want to make this as interactive as possible using this somewhat different format. So if I ask you a question, go ahead and use the chat box to type an answer back to me. So I'm going to start right off the bat with a question. Which one of you thinks you're tuning in from the furthest geographic distance from Southeast Florida? Anybody coming in from out of state today? Let's see how this chat function works. Stuart, that's not very far. Oh, Southern Illinois. So far, we've got Illinois as a winner. Anybody else from out of state? All right, New Jersey. Uh-oh, I think New Jersey just beat Southern Illinois. Fantastic, guys. Now, if you have any specific questions you'd like me to answer, instead of using the chat window, which pretty quickly gets filled up with comments, I want you to use the Q&A button. The Q&A button will allow your question to kind of sit there in waiting. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll go through all the Q&As that I have time for, and I'll try to answer your questions. So chat is your way of answering my questions. Q&A is your way of asking me questions. All right, let's get going. So today's talk is primarily about oysters, but I want to start out looking at kind of a bigger picture issue. Our oceans are in rough shape. I think it should come as no surprise that globally our fisheries are in decline. And this applies to big things like bluefin tuna and small things like shrimp and crabs. But for the last 50, 60, 70 years, we've seen patterns of population declines globally for numerous harvested fish species. And I want you guys to think about this for a second. What are some of the reasons that fisheries are on the decline at the global scale? And go ahead and use your chat feature if you want to throw some answers out there. You know, we're in a world that relies pretty heavily on the ocean for food. And one of the obvious answers to declines in marine species involves overharvests. But we also, yeah, there we got some answers. So unclean water, pollution, ocean acidification, overfishing, these are all really good guesses. So I think you guys, you understand the scope of the problem, and it's far beyond just overfishing. But in reality, for most marine taxa that are in decline, overfishing is the biggest issue. So when we look at this graph, overexploitation or overharvest is pretty much the largest factor driving the declines in marine organisms. Second on that list is habitat loss. And that's kind of my area of expertise. I am a fish ecologist. I study game fish, things like bonefish and tarpon, snook, permit. And I don't just study the fish for the fish's sake. I study the habitats that they live in, what we've done to damage those habitats, and what we're doing to try to restore those habitats. So that's why, as a fish ecologist, I got involved in habitat restoration work. So overharvest and habitat loss are really big issues, and it may surprise you to see that all those other issues are not quite as important, at least right now. So climate change, eutrophication, pollution, invasive species are all on the radar, but they're not quite as important as the obvious ones. We're taking too many animals out of the ocean, and we're destroying the habitats that those animals live in. Now in Florida, our estuaries have been highly modified in the last century or so. On the left here, you can see an aerial view of the Loxahatchee River. This is one of the rivers that I've spent a lot of time doing research on. It is in Jupiter, so it's just about 30 or 40 minutes south of Stuart. And as recently as 1940 in this aerial, there's not much going on in Jupiter. If you look at this map, and hopefully you'll be able to see my mouse as I move it, there's a little settlement right here near the coast. There's a railroad bridge, and I think there was probably a wooden bridge by 1940. But everything west of town, this area out here, this was all wetlands, seasonal wetlands that flowed into the Loxahatchee River itself. And we had this incredible undisturbed natural ecosystem. Fast forward to today, there's almost nothing left in the Loxahatchee watershed that's natural, with the exception of this wonderful protected area in the upper headwaters of the northwest fork of the Loxahatchee, Jonathan Dickinson State Park. Have any of you spent time in Jonathan Dickinson, maybe kayaking in the upper river here? My point with these two pictures is that we, in a very short period of time, have done a number on Florida's waterways. I'm sure some of you may live in houses that were built pre-1940. Some of you may have spent time in Europe, or you may have stayed in a hotel that was 200 or 300 years old. Florida has the oldest city in the United States with St. Augustine, but it was actually one of the last states to be fully developed. It was the Wild West here into the early 1900s. So in a really short period of time, we have highly modified our estuaries and the habitats that they support. All right, so what is an estuary? I think it's important to get a definition out of the way. Does anybody know what defines an estuary? What makes a body of water an estuary? I know some of you have an answer for this. Yeah, fantastic. It's a place where freshwater and saltwater meet or mix. So the water in an estuary is not as salty as the ocean. It's not as fresh as a lake or a river. It's brackish. And in our area, we have two main types of estuaries. First, we have a flooded river mouth estuary. You're looking at an aerial image of a flooded river mouth estuary right now. This estuary is where the Loxahatchee River flows into the Atlantic Ocean through Jupiter Inlet. If you've ever gone to the Jupiter Lighthouse or snorkeled at Jupiter Inlet, that is the connection between the upper Loxahatchee River and the Atlantic Ocean. And by my definition, kind of this area, the lower, wider portion of the Loxahatchee would be the estuary, and then the upper, narrow portion would be the river. But there's another type of estuary in our area. It's a bar-built estuary or a lagoonal estuary. Does anybody know the name of the very important bar-built or lagoonal estuary that we have in our part of the state? I know everybody has the answer to this one, I hope. Yes, of course. It's the Indian River Lagoon estuary. So the Indian River Lagoon is a little bit different. It is not a river flowing out to sea. It is a long, skinny, linear body of water that runs up and down the east coast of Florida. It starts a little bit south of Daytona Beach, runs all the way down to Jupiter, about 156 miles long. And actually, if you can see my mouse right where I'm pointing here, just inside of Jupiter Inlet, this is the southern terminus of the Indian River Lagoon. And it runs as one straight shot all the way up the east coast of Florida. Now, the Indian River Lagoon is an incredible ecosystem, worthy of an entire hour-long lecture in and of itself. But for today, I just want to point out that it's an important part of our oyster restoration story. Now, Florida's estuary and habitats are being altered in two interconnected but very distinct ways. First is the direct loss of important natural habitats. We have literally come in over the last century and bulldozed mangroves and replaced natural shorelines with seawalls and dredged through our oyster reefs to create boating channels. We have physically damaged and destroyed our estuarine habitats. But there's another issue we're dealing with, and that's the anthropogenic control of freshwater inflow and freshwater pollution. Now, it might seem weird to think about water flow in a habitat story, but if you're an aquatic animal, water is a critical part of your habitat. So yes, we've gone in and physically bulldozed habitats, but we're also affecting the timing and quantity and quality of freshwater flowing into estuaries, which has a negative impact on the habitats in those ecosystems. So the first problem is pretty obvious. When you look at an aerial view of coastal Florida, there's not much in the way of natural habitat left. This is an aerial view of the Loxahatchee estuary. And in this entire basin, there's only about, I'd say, a quarter acre of natural mangroves left. This little island right here is really the only vestige of natural mangroves left in this particular estuary. And the same thing applies to most of Florida's coastal estuaries. We like to live on the water, and we've gone in and done a pretty good job of developing those natural shorelines into places that we like to live. We didn't do it maliciously. We didn't realize the environmental outcome of clearing shorelines and creating backyards where there once were mangrove forests, but we're starting to see now that it has pretty major impacts on natural ecosystems. Less obvious is this alteration of freshwater inflow. In the last century, we have completely replumbed Florida. There were incredible efforts in the late 1800s and early 1900s aimed at draining the Everglades. We didn't realize what a treasure the Everglades were, and it was primarily seen as a wasteland, and the rich muck soils that were in existence under the historical Everglades were seen as a great place to grow crops. So early settlers in Florida worked diligently with the support of the state and federal government to drain the Everglades. This is going to be something that we discuss in our next lecture. But for today, I just want to point out that this network of canals that over the last century has basically overtaken most of South Florida, that canal network leads to some issues with water delivery. Water is entering our estuaries at the wrong time of year, the wrong quantity, and the wrong quality. And all three of those factors have impacts on coastal ecosystems. So when we think about habitat loss, whether it's the physical loss of shorelines and reefs or that alteration of water quality, both of those affect critical estuarine habitats, things like mangrove forests, seagrass beds, and oyster reefs. And these are important places. Roughly 80 to 90% of the saltwater fish we like to go fishing for fun, and about 75% of commercially harvested fish rely on estuaries at some point during their life cycle. So estuaries are really important places, particularly from an economic perspective. Now today, we're really here to learn about oyster reefs and oyster restoration, but I'm going to talk a bit about mangroves and seagrass as well. And I want you to understand that these three are highly related to each other. We're going to talk about the benefits of oyster reefs, but in the back of your head, I want you to try to think about the benefits of mangrove forests and seagrass beds. And you'll realize that many of the benefits that we talk about today, specifically related to oysters, also apply to mangroves and seagrasses. And we'll come back to oysters and mangroves and seagrasses at the end as we tie all three of these habitats together. Now, at this point, I have another question for all of you to answer. What is a habitat? What makes something a habitat? Anybody have any thoughts on what a habitat is? I know we have some science folks in the audience. Go ahead and chime in. So it is a part of the environment. Good. It's a place that supports life. Yeah, it's an environment that an organism lives in. Great answers, guys. Yeah, so really it's a place where animals live out in the wild. So when we think of an oyster reef as a habitat, we're thinking about the animals that occupy and live on and rely on that oyster reef. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today involves habitats. So what is an oyster? I know many of you have probably eaten your fair share of oysters over time, but you might not realize exactly what one is. Well, they are a type of mollusk. Mollusks are a really weird group of animals. Arguably, they're one of the weirdest group of animals because they don't all look alike. If I were to give you 10 different birds, you would know that they were all birds. If I gave you 10 different mammals, you would know that they were mammals. If I gave you 10 different fish, I could probably think of a few weird fish, maybe like an eel or a seahorse that might trick you up a little bit, but I bet you'd recognize most of them as being fish. If I gave you 10 mollusks, I would argue that most of you probably would not lump them together as the same phylogenetic group of animals. They're really different from one another. In the world of mollusks, we have univalves, like a conch. We have bivalves, like a clam or an oyster. So what do you think the word valve means in mollusk speak? Anybody have a guess as to what a valve is? Yeah, it's the shell. So a univalve has one shell. A bivalve has two shells. And then we've got this unique character down here. This is a chiton. They've got a bunch of shells. Their Latin name basically means many-shelled organism. And then we've got some really special mollusks that don't have a shell at all. Our cephalopods, octopus, squid, cuttlefish. We go from something as simple as the lowly clam to as complicated and advanced as the giant octopus, arguably the smartest invertebrate animal on Earth. We've had octopuses at the Coastal Center that actually learned to unscrew jar lids to get their dinner. So you see what I mean when I say this is a very diverse group of animals, and many of them are completely unrelated to one another from a physical perspective, but they are related internally and molecularly and genetically. So all mollusks are invertebrates. Most of them have an exoskeleton, and that's where a lot of the similarities stop. Let's specifically take a look at why oysters are important. Why do they matter? And this is an important part of our lecture today. If oysters aren't important, we wouldn't take the time to try to restore them. Can anybody think of some reasons why oysters are valuable? And I want to coach you a little bit. Let's start by thinking about the cash value of oysters. Who financially benefits from healthy, living, thriving oyster reefs? Think maybe from a seafood perspective, first and foremost. Yeah, so they're a food source for us. People eat oysters. We have for a very, very long time. In fact, I mentioned the Jupiter Lighthouse earlier. If you've ever been up in the Jupiter Lighthouse, it's built on top of a big mound of land. That mound of land is a shell midden created by the Ais Indians who lived here long before the Spanish settled in Florida. And much of that shell midden is actually built up of old shellfish remains. And in fact, I have some colleagues that are biologists who study these ancient piles of shell, and they can tell a lot about water quality and salinity and climate in prehistoric times just by looking at the layers of thrown away shells in Native American shell middens or shell piles. So they're a food source. And who benefits from that food source? Well, we do, but more specifically, there are fisher folks who go out and catch wild oysters. There are aquaculture facilities and hatcheries that grow oysters in captivity. There are wholesalers and retailers and restaurants who benefit. One of my 5th grade students recently reminded me that people like pearls. So pearls grow in certain types of oysters. There's another financial benefit associated with healthy oyster reefs. So those are the real obvious benefits from a food perspective. But there's a little problem. In the state of Florida, the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services regulates where we're allowed to harvest shellfish. They've actually created maps that show you different approved shellfish harvest areas. This is our local shellfish harvest map. It runs from Vero Beach at the top down to Fort Pierce at the bottom. Other than a small area around Harbor Branch, which is approved for some limited clam harvesting, we're not allowed to harvest oysters to eat in our part of Florida. And actually, south of Fort Pierce, there are no approved or regulated shellfish harvest waters on the east coast of Florida. It's not necessarily a pollution issue. It has to do with a combination of things. Pollution combined with water temperature. In warmer areas, bacteria grow in our waters. Those bacteria can get trapped inside of the oyster, and if you eat raw oysters, they can make you sick. So it's not necessarily just about polluted water. Some of these harmful bacteria are actually naturally occurring, healthy, normal parts of our ecosystem. On top of that, they're also concerned about some of those not so healthy types of bacteria, the red tide algae blooms, the cyanobacteria algae blooms, and a number of other harmful algal organisms that live in our part of the Indian River Lagoon. So you can't go out and harvest oysters in our area to eat. Then why do they matter? Why do we care so much about oysters if we can't go out and eat the things? Well, that brings up another set of values that are associated with healthy oysters and healthy oyster reefs. I want to introduce you all to a term called ecosystem services. Ecosystem services refer to the benefits that people obtain from healthy ecosystems. So in the case of oysters, they have an awful lot of value above and beyond what we typically think of as their food value. What else do oysters provide us with? Well, a number of things. First, they're really good at filtering water. One big, good-sized oyster under perfect conditions can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. The actual number is probably much lower than that, but we're still talking about tens of gallons of water per oyster per day. I like to think of them as little aquarium filters like I have in my fish tank behind me here. They also work to stabilize shorelines and reduce erosion that can be generated by wind and storms and hurricanes. And that factor increases property value. If you're a waterfront homeowner and you've got an oyster reef behind your house, your shoreline's not going to get eroded, your water's going to be cleaner and clearer, and that has direct financial implications on the value of your property. We talked about oysters as food for us. It turns out they're also food for lots of other animals in the environment. They create a unique opportunity for bottom-dwelling animals to eat food that's not readily available. And that process is called Benthic-Pelagic Coupling. Rather than explain it now, I have a gorgeously drawn illustration to show you in a minute that will tell you more about this Benthic-Pelagic Coupling concept. And then finally, most importantly from my perspective as a fish ecologist, these healthy oyster reefs provide a structurally complex, safe, complicated habitat for other animals to live in, primarily different species of fishes and shellfish. Think of oyster reefs as a condominium complex for other animals that we value. These ecosystem services are really at the heart of why oyster restoration is such a big deal in the Indian River Lagoon and other areas, not just here in Florida, but Chesapeake Bay has done an incredible job of restoring native oyster populations over the last 2 decades or so. So let's go through some of these ecosystem services one at a time, starting with oysters as filters. Here is a view that many of you are familiar with. This is an oyster that you would get at a raw bar. All that we've done here is remove the top valve from the oyster, the top shell. I'm sure you guys have seen this, but I would imagine that most of you don't know what you're looking at. There are a couple of things that you see from this view. First is this ruffly layer, very, very thin tissue. This is called the mantle of the oyster. There's actually 2 mantles. There's one here on the front side, and then if you look where my mouse is pointing, there's another one on the back side. They hang down like a set of curtains on either side of the oyster shell. The mantle is what grows the oyster shell. The mantle tissue takes calcium out of the seawater and creates a shiny, lustrous material that makes up the shell itself. That shiny, lustrous material is the exact same stuff that pearls are made out of. So the mantle grows the shell of the oyster. Here, this white shape is the actual muscle that connects the top shell to the bottom shell. When you eat an oyster, you are eating everything in the oyster. You're eating the mantle, you're eating this muscle, you're eating the oyster's reproductive organs, their stomach, their intestines, their digestive tract. This is one of the reasons I don't really eat oysters. Now, if you like scallops, all you're eating with a scallop is this nice round white muscle that connects the 2 shells. I'm going to go one step further. For this next slide, I'm going to flip back the mantle and reveal the next layer of the oyster. So now the mantle is flipped up. You can see it here. And under the mantle are some layers that have stripes or striations on them. These are the oyster's gills. Gills in most aquatic animals function for respiration. They take oxygen out of the water and they give off carbon dioxide. And an oyster's gills do that, but they do something else. The gills in an oyster are the actual filter mechanism that oysters use to clean up our water. It's also how they catch their dinner. Oysters aren't filtering just to be generous. They are filtering food out of the water. What's their favorite food? Microscopic particles, primarily algae. Remember, not all algae are bad. When we do our next lecture focused on algae blooms, you guys are going to get to learn about the not so good types of algae that live in our waterways. But there are lots of really good types of algae out there, and oysters take advantage of those algae blooms as their food source. So how does an oyster filter? They actually have a microscopic pumping system built into their body. We cannot see this pumping system with the naked eye, but there are microscopic structures on those gills that work like little conveyor belts. They are called cilia. And if any of you remember back to high school biology and microscope slides that have living animals with cilia, cilia are little fibers that vibrate and beat, and they create water movement or current. So on an oyster's gills, there are countless cilia that work to catch particles of algae and move those particles into the oyster's mouth. Let me show you what I mean. These little red dots on the left side of the oyster represent individual microscopic cells of algae. As the oyster feeds, you will see these cells stick to the gills and actually get transported to the oyster's mouth over here on the far right. And you can see near the mouth, there are some structures called labial palps. These are sort of like the oyster's lips. I like to think of them as windshield wipers. They work to wipe the gills off and pull food into the oyster's mouth. My animation is not very convincing, so I have an actual video that I took under the microscope to show you this process. On this next slide, in the left side, you're going to see a cloud of red dye in the water. Watch what the oyster does to that dye. And I want to let you know that red dye is acting as a surrogate for algae. So watch here, we've got a cloud of red dye over here, and you'll see the oyster actually sticks to that dye with its gills. The particles over here are getting gathered together into clumps, and those clumps are then being pushed all the way to the right side where the oyster's mouth is. That conveyor belt is how oysters take microscopic algae particles out of the water and move them into their mouth. I have another video. Let me flip to the next one. You can see here a little further along, all that microscopic cloudy dye gets gathered together into these tight kind of mucus-wrapped clumps that the oyster is able to eat. This is how oysters clean algae blooms out of our estuaries. This is really important, and it's pretty cool to see it in person. Now, scaling this up a little bit, our next video shows two aquariums side by side. The one on the left has no oysters in it. The one on the right has oysters in it. In this 30-minute time lapse, you can actually see the oysters cleaning the algae-stained water out of the right aquarium. This is pretty telling. And remember, these oysters are doing this constantly, all day. As long as they're submerged underwater, they are filtering and cleaning our estuary. I don't think I have to convince you that this filtration is a pretty important ecosystem service that healthy oysters provide for us. Now, here's another thing they provide for us. They break up wave energy, they reduce erosion, and they prevent shorelines from washing away. Now, you're saying, Zach, those are mangroves, not oysters. Well, remember earlier I said that there's a lot of overlap between the ecosystem services provided by oysters, mangroves, and seagrasses. Here's a perfect example. I couldn't find a good video of a wave tank with oysters in it, but this is a fantastic example of a wave tank with mangrove trees. Those waves on the left are immediately slowed down and broken up just by these wimpy mangrove trees. The shoreline on the right, your backyard, my backyard, is being protected from those waves just by the mangrove trees. Well, guess what? Oysters and seagrasses do exactly the same thing. We talked a little bit about oysters as human food earlier. They're also food for lots of different wild animals. My favorite example of an animal that eats oysters is the American oyster catcher. These are one of the coolest birds we have around. I don't see them very often. They're pretty unusual. Have any of you ever seen an oyster catcher in person? Really neat bird. Their bill, instead of being flattened like a duck's bill, is flattened a little bit more in a vertical plane. They are able to quietly walk up to an oyster that's only cracked open just a little tiny bit, and they stab that bill into the oyster and they sever the muscle that holds the two halves of the oyster shell together. The oyster opens up and the bird's able to eat the living oyster out of the inside. Stone crabs are also another good example of an animal that relies on the actual oyster itself for food. Small stone crabs eat baby oysters. Big stone crabs can actually crush a full-grown oyster and eat the tissue inside. Thankfully, stone crabs have a much better personality than blue crabs. If stone crabs had the ferocious nature of blue crabs, nobody would ever harvest them. They'd be too scary. One of my old academic advisors routinely said that blue crabs were the meanest animal out in the ocean. Thankfully, stone crabs have a little bit of a nicer demeanor. All right, here is my incredibly sophisticated drawing to illustrate our next ecosystem service provided by Healthy Oyster Reefs, Benthic-Pelagic Coupling. The word benthic refers to bottom dwelling. The word pelagic refers to living up in the water column. In an estuary, one of the most important food sources is algae. Algae get their energy from the sun. They take sunlight and carbon dioxide. They create energy. They create sugars for their own growth, and they give off oxygen. So that's a good thing. They're also food for other animals in the estuary. When we talk about the food web in an estuary in a second, the very bottom of the food web usually is algae. The problem is most animals that live in the estuary aren't very good at catching algae out of the water. Remember, these are microscopic organisms. You need a microscope to even see them. So if you look at my friend the crab down here, just in case you couldn't tell, that's a crab. They aren't built to pinch algae out of the water. It'd be like trying to eat jelly beans with chopsticks. It just doesn't work. But over here, we have an oyster. And as we just learned, oysters are great at filtering algae out of the water. When they're done filtering the algae, they digest it. And then out the other end comes oyster poop, as well as something called pseudofeces. If any of you are familiar with owl pellets, when an owl eats, some stuff goes out the other end, and then certain things that they can't digest very well come back up through the top. Oysters are kind of the same. They digest some of their food, and then things that they can't digest, they pack together and spit back out as pseudofeces. Now, instead of having cloudy, algae-filled water, we've got dense particles that settle down to the bottom. Those particles still have nutrition in them. So animals like crabs and shrimp and snails and little fish can actually get nutrition from eating oyster poop. It's one way that energy from the water, this pelagic energy from algae, can get transferred to the animals that live on the bottom in the oyster reef. And then these little animals are very important, and I'll show you why in just a second. They are animals that actually become part of the food web in our estuary. So these oyster reefs, as I mentioned earlier, function like apartment complexes. They provide habitat for lots and lots of different animals. And as a reminder, a habitat is just the home or environment that a specific animal or plant lives in. Oyster reefs provide shelter for dozens and dozens of different fish and invertebrate species. The numbers are staggering, not just here in Florida, but globally. These are really important habitats. And when we think about the animals that live on an oyster reef, there are two general categories of oyster reef associated animals. There are creatures that spend their entire life living on an oyster reef, and there are animals that only use the oyster reef as their nursery, their first home, the place they live when they're babies. So in this picture, anybody know what this fish is? And how about this fish? Anybody have any guesses? I'll give you a hint. They are going to get quite a bit bigger someday. Let's see how your ichthyological skills are this afternoon. Very good. Grouper and snapper. This is a tiny baby mangrove snapper. It's hard to tell in the picture, but on my hand, it's about that big. And then this in my hand here is the smallest baby Goliath grouper that I've ever caught. This little fish will get to be 600 pounds someday. So when we think about little snapper and little grouper, they use oyster reefs heavily, but they only use them when they're little, and then they migrate somewhere else as adults. But there are other fish and invertebrates that use the oyster reef throughout their life. This is a frill-fin goby. They only get to be about that big. They're a predator, but they're only a predator of other little tiny things. And then we've got stone crabs, mud crabs, porcelain crabs, snapping shrimp. These are animals that are incredibly abundant on oyster reefs, and they spend their entire life on the reef. In fact, you can go out and collect the animals that live on an oyster reef, and they're one way of telling how healthy that reef is. And we'll circle back to that towards the end of the program. Oyster reefs are what we consider well, I guess not oyster reefs, but oysters themselves are what we consider a keystone species. As one single species, they're able to support lots of other species. So think about an old stone arch or a stone doorway. The key stone at the top is holding up the weight of both sides of the archway. So oysters are one good example of a keystone species. Can anybody else think of a very charismatic keystone species that we see here in Florida fairly often? I guess I'll give you a hint. I see these driving down the side of the road on a regular basis. We're getting some guesses. Let's see here. There it is. Gopher tortoise is the one that I was looking for. Gopher tortoises in Florida are a keystone species. By digging a burrow that can extend as far as 40 feet under the surface of the ground, they provide a fire-safe, weather-safe shelter for literally hundreds of other animals. So they are considered a keystone species. Without gopher tortoises, there are animals that would not exist. Oysters are also ecosystem engineers. And I saw somebody mention beavers a second ago. Perfect, good segue. This is a beaver dam. Beavers like to live in ponds and lakes. Ponds and lakes aren't always available, so beavers make their own. They cut down trees, they build a dam, and behind that dam, a pond is formed. Beavers don't do this to be beneficial to other animals. They do it very selfishly. They just want deep water for safety and shelter. But as a result, many other animals benefit, including muskrats, mink, ducks, fish. So they are engineering their own ecosystem. And as a result, they also become a keystone species. So to the person who mentioned beavers as a keystone species, you are absolutely correct. Can anybody think of another keystone species, another ecosystem engineer that we see here in Florida? If you're a scuba diver, you should know exactly what I'm talking about. That's right, yeah, coral and coral reefs. So corals are an ecosystem engineer. We generally think of corals as kind of rocks with slime on top of them, to quote one of my old professors. He was not a coral biologist. But in fact, corals are animals. They're living creatures that create their own skeletons, and those skeletons can get rather enormous. The skeleton of a living coral is designed to protect the coral, but accidentally, those complex skeletons become a home for many other animals. So coral reefs are an example of an animal engineering an ecosystem. Now, the other thing that we've sort of danced around a little bit is the importance of oysters and the animals that live on oyster reefs when we think about food webs. The old word for this is food chain. Food chain is pretty easy to understand. Sunlight grows a plant. A caterpillar eats the plant, a bird eats the caterpillar, a bobcat eats the bird. That's very linear. In reality, we don't see that kind of linearity. We see more of an intertangled web of who eats whom. So the term that we use now is food web. Remember, in an estuary, the very, very bottom of the food web is typically algae. Sunlight grows the algae, and then we've got all these little critters that are able to eat the algae. Those oyster-related organisms are a critical component of our estuaries' food webs. Remember, little things are eaten by medium-sized things, which are eaten by big things, and humans tend to like big things. So if you're an angler, you might like catching snook and redfish and tarpon. They eat things that eat things that eat little crabs and shrimp and fish. If you like dolphins, they're cool. They rely on food that eats things that live on oyster reefs. So even though these bigger animals are a few steps removed from the tiny little creatures that live on the oyster reef, they are still relying on the healthy oyster reef for sustenance. And remember, some of the little animals that call the oyster reef home are really important from an economic perspective and as recreationally targeted species. So I think it's pretty clear that oyster reefs are important, but there's a problem. They're dying off at an alarming rate. In fact, over the last century, planet Earth has lost about 85% of its oyster reefs. So as a result, we're talking about restoration today. Restoration has become a tool that is sometimes useful and sometimes necessary to help maintain living oyster reefs. And I have to tell you, just as a segue, many early oyster restoration efforts had nothing to do with all the ecosystem services I just outlined. Remember the very first value of oysters we talked about? Seafood? Well, oyster harvesters realized that they were over-harvesting oysters in certain estuaries, and they started implementing very simple rudimentary restoration techniques, like putting out the empty oyster shell that they had left over after the oysters were shucked to create habitat for new oysters to colonize and grow. Now, most of the time when we think about oyster restoration, we're not so much focused on growing oysters for their human food value. We're focused on growing oysters for the ecosystem services that we just went over. Take a look at this map of the St. Lucie estuary. Just for reference, if we look at this map, Florida Oceanographic Society is right about here. Here is Sailfish Point. Here is Sewell's Point. And then we've got the Roosevelt Bridge in downtown Stuart right about here. There were a lot of oyster reefs in the St. Lucie River historically. I'm actually reading a book right this minute written in the late 1800s. It's called Cruising and Camping in Florida. I recommend it if any of you want a great read. And it tells the story of a sailor who travels down the Indian River Lagoon 140, 150 years ago. I can't read 10 pages without him talking about the expansive oyster reefs that used to occur in our estuary. And the St. Lucie was no exception. The Indian River Lagoon and the St. Lucie specifically were great oyster habitats historically. So this is a map roughly showing where oyster reefs existed from 1940 to 1960. Fast forward another 2 decades, 1960 to 1980 brings about some changes. You could see our oyster reefs have shrunken considerably. The next step is even more disheartening. 1980 to 1996, there's almost no healthy oyster reef left in the St. Lucie. We've lost 80% of our historical oyster reef cover in the last 60, 70, 80 years. Now take a look at this map. I wanted to show you this one second because all of those layers I just showed you are overlain on one another. Basically what you're looking at here, the 1940 to 60 layer is in orange. The 1960 to 80 layer is in that pinkish color. The 1990 to 96 layer here is green. You see there's not very much. But the good news is the most recent layer, the 2011 to 2015 layer, there's actually some more oyster growth. And I just found out from one of our oyster scientists, Dr. Glenn Coldren, that FOS assisted the South Florida Water Management District with their latest survey in 2019. So we should have an updated map at some point in the near future. Some of this new blue oyster growth is natural, but much of it is a result of extensive oyster restoration efforts in the St. Lucie estuary over the last decade. And you can see all of these little oyster-shaped icons represent areas where restoration reefs have been built, and FOS has been involved with just about all of those restoration projects. Now, I want to go back to this graph we looked at earlier. And we were pretty clear that habitat loss and overexploitation were really the driving factors behind species declines on a global scale. And I mentioned that overexploitation is largely agreed to be the biggest issue that we're dealing with globally. Let me show you what overexploitation looks like from the perspective of an oyster. That is an enormous oyster canning factory. We didn't have good refrigeration back in the 1800s. People loved to eat oysters though. So these oysters were harvested in enormous, enormous numbers, shipped to packing houses, canned, and then their excess shells were discarded. If you look closely, this mountain of shell has 3 human beings standing on it. These are people. So you can really see the scale of harvest that was occurring. So obviously overharvest has been a big issue, especially in areas where commercial harvest has been established for a long time. I'm thinking places like Chesapeake Bay. But what else do you think might be harming oyster populations? Do you guys have any thoughts on what else may be damaging oysters kind of, here in Florida as well as globally? What do you guys think? Some of them are obvious. Some of them are less obvious. There we go. I see a mention of freshwater and saltwater. So salinity changes, very good. Dredging, huge issues. Dredging, hormones. So things coming out of wastewater treatment plants and septic tanks getting into our waterway. More generally, pollution, anthropogenic pollution. Anthropogenic is a word that I use a whole lot, but it might not be a word you guys hear too often. Anthropogenic is just an adjective referring to something that is caused by humans. So anthropogenic disturbances are disturbances that we have triggered. Good, you guys hit on some of the important ones. There are a few that we didn't cover. We talked about dredging. We talked about pollution. We talked about salinity and development. We didn't talk about sedimentation. When you take that aerial photo of Jupiter from 1940 and you translate it to present day, land use has greatly changed over time. We used to have wetlands in the upper part of the estuary. Now we've got farmland and urban areas. All of that runoff brings sediment into our estuaries, and that sediment can bury oyster reefs. Remember that. Burial is a big problem. Oysters get diseases just like we do. They are affected by ocean acidification. Atmospheric pollution is leading to acid rain. Acid rain is making our oceans a tiny bit more acidic. And in fact, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can directly get absorbed into the ocean, and that carbonic acid that forms as a result is acidic. And animals like oysters and corals and certain types of plankton that use calcium to make their shell can actually be dissolved thanks to very, very small changes in ocean pH. And then finally, invasive species can harm oysters. Just last night, I read an article about an invasive fish affecting the Great Lakes called the round goby. That fish can live in freshwater and saltwater. Scientists are concerned that if it gets into the Susquehanna River, it may reach the oyster beds of the Chesapeake Bay. So invasive species can be a big deal. What can we do to fix those problems? Well, literally just take the list I gave you and find a solution to each thing. We can create regulations to protect oysters from overharvest. We can have land use regulations to reduce coastal development or cause coastal development to be conducted in a safer manner. We can resist proposals to dredge our estuaries. We can control pollution washing into our estuaries. We can manage those freshwater inflows to create more natural salinity patterns. We can protect oyster reefs, create protected areas to reduce harvest and destruction. We can stop the spread of invasive species. And most importantly, we can restore oyster reefs. And that's where I want to take this next. I want to talk a little bit more about how oyster restoration works. And to do that, you have to understand the life cycle of an oyster. Oyster restoration is focused over here on the kind of the larval and juvenile phase of an oyster's life. Oysters can't swim. They are permanently attached to the bottom as adults. Clams and scallops, even though they're bivalves, they're able to move around a little bit, but not oysters. So when it's time for oysters to reproduce, they actually release their reproductive material right into the water. They release eggs and sperm, and those eggs and sperm fuse together, creating a larval oyster. And believe it or not, for the first 2 weeks or so of an oyster's life, they swim and they drift and they move around with the current. They can go up and down to catch a ride on different current areas. They're able to move around pretty well. After 2 weeks or so, they start to look for a forever home. Their favorite thing to stick to is another oyster shell. How come? Well, if they can find another adult oyster, that's a good sign that they're in a spot that's conducive to the growth of oyster reefs. They are able to smell the smell of a healthy oyster reef. And they use a cement gland to literally glue themselves down to another oyster shell. And that's what we see right here. This is a baby oyster, about as big as my pinky fingernail. The name for a baby oyster after it attaches to a hard substrate is spat. Spat. So I'm not talking about spitting. I'm talking about a baby oyster when I say the word spat. Not only do they stick to other oysters, but they stick to things like clamshells, mussels, barnacles, even limestone and concrete. But they really like to stick to hard substrate. So in order to build an oyster reef, we have to go back to that I guess probably late 1980s movie, The Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. This is a video of baby oysters while they were actually in that swimming phase of their life. Pretty cool to think of an oyster as swimming. These little oysters are the heart of our restoration work. We're able to tell that in many parts of our estuary, there are enough baby oysters still around to support restoration. The problem is we don't have enough substrate. In many areas, sedimentation has buried all of our old oyster reefs, and there's nothing for these little oysters to stick to. So we've got lots of baby oysters. We don't have anywhere for them to stick. The heart of oyster restoration in most places involves putting out hard substrate called culch for oysters to stick to. Now, usually culch is oyster shell collected from restaurants, but it can also be fossilized shell that comes out of quarries. Sometimes it's even bits of rock or limestone or concrete. And down here at the bottom, this is an example of one restaurant clamshell that has 13 oyster spat stuck to it, baby oysters. This picture really tells you the story behind oyster restoration. If you give them hard calcium-based substrate and there's enough babies in the water, they will settle. And that brings us to the Florida Oceanographic Oyster Restoration Program, our FLORD program. Some of you have actually volunteered as part of the FLORD program. One of our scientists, Dr. Glenn Coldren, has taken the lead with the FLORD program over the last few years. This is the program where we go out to local restaurants, pick up oyster shells, and in fact, if you look at our year-round average, we bring in about 1,000 pounds of oyster shell every week to recycle. We use volunteers to bag the shell up into mesh bags, and then we load those bags up, and using a bucket brigade, we go out in the water and we build oyster reefs. And if you look, this is an old oyster reef that's already got stuff growing on it. There are living oysters here, and these students are helping us build a new section of reef that will become the next intertidal reef in this area. Sometimes we have to use a little hatchery help. In our part of the estuary, there are enough adult oysters to provide millions of little baby larvae. But in some areas, especially the northern Indian River Lagoon, there aren't as many living oysters around. So instead, we have to precede our restaurant oyster shells with baby oysters. Thankfully for FOS, one of our partners is a shellfish hatchery, the Great American Shellfish Company, run by Tom McCrudden. If you've ever walked around our nature trail, there's a wooden gate back there. That is where Tom's private shellfish hatchery is located. We don't have to use that hatchery too often, but occasionally we're able to use those hatchery-raised baby oysters to precede our oyster reefs before we deploy them. And if you look, after about a year or so, these reefs are completely covered in healthy oysters in the best scenario. So in a spot that is really conducive to oyster growth, like here in downtown Stuart, the oysters grow very quickly and are able to cover those bags all the way. And if you look, you can actually see the baby oysters stuck to the restaurant oyster shells. There's also things like mussels attached to these clumps. You can barely see the plastic bags, and over time, those plastic bags disappear. Now that's a small scale restoration. I'm fortunate to have been a part of a much bigger restoration in the Loxahatchee River. Here, we actually used heavy equipment to build a 3-acre oyster restoration reef. This whole area had conditions that were conducive to oyster growth, but the bottom was all sand. We built a reef using fossilized rock and shell material, and I'm gonna tell you more about that in just a minute. We're gonna wrap up the program with some science here in just a second. When I talk about the science that I've done on the Loxahatchee, This is the reef that we're talking about. Big, large-scale, 3-acre restoration. Now, moving on, oyster restorations are fantastic at providing some ecosystem services, but we've realized that we can do more. We've started creating living shorelines as part of our restoration work. A living shoreline is a restoration tool that uses oysters and seagrasses and mangroves and Spartina grass to create a natural shoreline that breaks up wave energy and reduces erosion while providing all of those ecosystem services that we talked about earlier. And this is the direction that Florida Oceanographic Society has been taken in recent years. Rather than just building oyster reefs, we are building living shorelines, and those living shorelines are very unique based on the location that we're building them in. This is a generic image of a living shoreline. Basically, without any structure out here, storms and wave energy will erode the marsh or your backyard. By building a living shoreline, we're able to provide benefits to the environment and also benefits to the homeowner. This is a better diagram of the type of living shorelines that FOS creates. Here's your backyard. Your backyard hopefully has lots of native plants in it, not just St. Augustine grass. And then closer to the water's edge, we plant mangrove trees and marsh plants like Spartina to anchor the shoreline. And then out in the water, we build oyster reefs, and we're learning how to plant seagrass as well. And here is a behind the scenes glimpse of our mangrove and Spartina nursery. Some of you may have had a chance to explore on a guided tour of FOS. We have a really neat nursery back there that we use for our living shorelines. We also have an incredible seagrass nursery. We have about 50 tanks that are being used to grow seagrass in captivity. All of this seagrass is collected off of beaches. So we're not harvesting wild seagrass. We're just picking up scraps and learning how to grow it. And this is part of our foster program, which is run by Dr. Katie Tiling. Katie is spearheading efforts not just to grow seagrass in captivity, but to learn how best to plant that seagrass back out in the wild so it has a chance of surviving. Now check out these images of a living shoreline. This is incredible. Here we've got Spartina grass and a man-made oyster reef. Pretty cool, right? Well, look at this angle. This is a different section, and you can see that back here in the distance, there's no sand built up. It goes right up to this riprap seawall. By building an oyster reef and planting Spartina, we actually create new land along a living shoreline. You can see it here really well. These are mangrove trees and an oyster reef, and it's actually almost building a spit of land by breaking up wave energy and allowing settlement to settle down. We think that by breaking up that wave energy, we're also able to give seagrass a chance to root and colonize. Now, I have to touch on this because I'm sure some of you may ask me this. I know our program is wrapping up here in just a few more minutes. I will get to your questions at the end. I think we'll probably go just a little bit past 1 o'clock, but not too far past. I'm guessing that somebody may ask me about the plastic. We're very aware of plastics today, and you might be surprised to hear that as a biologist, as an ecologist, plastics aren't very high on my radar. To me, there are much bigger issues affecting our oceans other than plastics. That said, we still want to do our best to minimize the use of plastics. So first, the reason why we've used plastics for so long is it's kind of an industry standard in oyster restoration. It's been tested for a very long time. The type of plastics we use are relatively inert. And if the reef grows very well, look down here, the plastic is gone. It's completely encased, cemented in to the reef. So it's not breaking down. It's not flowing into the estuary. Now, the other reason we use plastic is we want our reefs to stay together for a long time. In certain areas like this photo, freshwater discharges occur, and those freshwater discharges can kill oysters. If an oyster reef dies and there's nothing holding it together, like our plastic bags, the reef will flatten back out and it can get buried under sediment. By using a non-biodegradable bag, even when the oysters die, the reef stays together, and during the next breeding season, baby oysters will come back into that area, reattach, and recolonize the reef. Now, I will tell you, FOS is working to eliminate plastic on our reefs. We have ongoing research looking at non-plastic options, testing experimentally to try to determine how we can build successful oyster reefs without necessarily using plastic. So I hope I answer your questions ahead of time. Plastic is a big issue, and we're on it. Now, the last topic that we're going to cover today is how we monitor the success of our restoration work. What's the point of building an oyster reef if you can't document that it's actually functioning somewhat similar to an oyster reef? So we need to find out whether our new reefs are healthy. Are oysters actually living on the reefs and growing? And how does that reef compare to a healthy living oyster reef? So we do a lot of sampling. We go out and we sample water quality, we sample oyster density and growth, we sample oyster health, and we look at the animals that live on the oyster reef. And again, that's my expertise, looking at the critters that call the oyster reefs home. So here's a good example of Dr. Glenn Cauldron in our research department measuring a clump of living oysters. Water quality is a big issue. This is Sam. She's a member of our research team, and she's measuring water quality using a device called a YSI. With a YSI, we can look at temperature, salinity, pH, dissolved oxygen. These are all important because, like Goldilocks, oysters have a very specific range of water quality parameters they like. Can't be too hot, can't be too cold. Low oxygen can kill oysters. High salinity can cause them to get diseases. Low salinity, like we get during Lake Okeechobee discharges, can actually be lethal. Oysters can hold their breath for roughly 2 weeks or so, but after that, if they're exposed to really low salinities, they start to die. As I mentioned, sediment's a big problem. We test sediment levels by putting out flat tables in the estuary, and we can actually measure the amount of sediment that falls onto those sediment measuring tables. And then we look at diseases and predators that move in. This is a big part of what our research team does after they build an oyster reef. So I mentioned oyster cover. We have to figure out how many oysters are covering the bottom of a restoration reef. Now, if I asked you what percent of the checkerboard is red, I would hope that all of you would very quickly say 50%. You didn't measure it, you just knew. If I asked you what percent of the pizza was covered in pepperoni, that might be a little trickier. We'd probably get a whole bunch of different answers. These are 2 oyster trays that I pulled out during my research. The one on the left has very few living oysters in it. The one on the right is almost entirely covered with living oysters. But what percent are each of these trays covered in oysters? Well, that gets pretty hard to measure. You know, I could say that, well, there's a living oyster here and maybe one here and one back here. And then on this one, almost all these are living oysters. But how do I measure that? Well, our researchers use something called a quadrat. Basically, it's a grid that you put on the bottom, and it turns the bottom into a checkerboard, and it makes it much easier to count and measure the number of oysters growing in an area. We also use these to measure seagrass density. Coral reef ecologists use them. Lots of scientists use quadrats as part of their measuring process. And then last but not least, the work that's near and dear to my heart, looking at the animals that move in to live in a man-made oyster reef after it's built. So one of the things that interests me is looking at how long it takes a restored oyster reef to start to function or look like a natural reef, not in terms of the oysters, but in terms of all the animals that live in the reef. And the way we sample this is by filling these big plastic trays with shell material. And you'll notice that under the shell material, there's a layer of screen. When we sample these out of the reef, we just lift them up very carefully, and all the water drains through the screen and the little critters are left behind. It's hard to imagine just how many little animals live in a section of oyster reef. This sample that you see below came from one plastic tray, so about 2 feet by 2 feet. You see in here hundreds of little crabs, baby shrimp, baby fish, and all of these animals are indicative of a healthy oyster reef. This is an experiment that I did on the Loxahatchee River, looking at how quickly a small-scale restoration reef gets colonized by animals. So what we're looking at in this graph is biomass. Basically, if I took all those animals, put them on a scale, how much do they weigh? The pink line represents a site that would eventually get an oyster reef built on it. The blue line represents a nearby site that didn't have an oyster reef and wasn't going to get one. You could see before we built our reef, biomass was very low at both sites. The bottom was sandy. Once we built an oyster reef at the pink site, almost immediately, there was a 5-fold increase in the amount of biomass at that site. So very quickly, animals move in. But that doesn't tell us the whole story. What animals move in? Well, that's where this comes in. These are some snapshots of the specific species that move into an oyster reef after it's built. I've got a 2-month snapshot. I've got a 12-month snapshot and a 22-month snapshot. The three that you see highlighted in yellow in all three panels are very important species in a healthy oyster reef: black-fingered mud crabs, crested gobies, and frillfin gobies. 2 species of little fish and 1 species of little crab. At 2 months, even though there are lots of different animals living on the reef, those 3 important ones aren't there yet. After a year, only 1 of the 3 important species is present. The other 2 are still absent. Finally, after a little bit less than 2 years, we start to see a fingerprint of animals living on the reef that looks almost identical to a natural reef. And we see that stepwise progression in oyster reefs no matter where we build them. So this is my final slide. I know you guys are probably anxious to ask some questions. This is kind of a summary of what I've seen in my oyster research from the perspective of the animals that move into a reef over time and the oysters themselves. So this relates back to that 3-acre reef that I built with the help of the Army Corps. I can't say I built it. I participated in the building of it. You know, nobody's ever let me drive a bulldozer yet, and I'm really frustrated. If anybody wants to let me do that, you'd make my life. But so we worked with the Army Corps of Engineers in Martin County to build that 3-acre oyster reef in the Loxahatchee a few years ago. And these numbers come from that 3-acre reef. After about 20 to 22 months, the types of animals that we found living on that reef and the biomass of animals living on that reef looked very similar to nearby oyster reefs that I had been studying for the previous decade. At that time, that 3-acre reef had about 3,500 pounds of tiny fish, shrimp, and crabs living in it. That's a lot of biomass when you think about how small these animals are. They are providing food for your snook and your tarpon and your redfish and your dolphins that live in the estuary. And then just as a cool little tidbit, we mathematically figured out, based on the number of oysters per square meter, that 3-acre reef was filtering about 18 million gallons of water every day. That's like 30 Olympic-sized swimming pools per day. So I hope all of this has shown you why oyster reefs are important, how oyster reefs are restored, and then how scientists go about monitoring those restored reefs to make sure they're staying healthy. With that, I really want to thank you for joining us for our first public Zoom-based lecture. And more importantly, I want to thank all of you for continuing to share our mission of inspiring environmental stewardship of Florida's coastal ecosystems. You are our voice, and I would like all of you to share what you learned today with your friends and family. You can do it with your voice. You can also do it by sharing the video of today's lecture. We will post this on our website at some point once we figure out how to do it. And with that, I want to mention quickly, we're providing these lectures free of charge to our community, but our Coastal Center has been closed for over a month, and that's our #1 source of income. So if any of you enjoyed what you saw today and you're in a position to be able to make a small donation of support to the Coastal Center and to FOS, head on to our website. In the top right-hand corner, you'll see a little yellow donate button. We would love your support in that way, but just as important as your support by sharing our mission and telling people about what you learned today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and open up my Q&A box and see where we're at with our questions. Let me see, here we go. Are crabs and shrimp mollusks too? Very good question. They are not. Now, they are lumped together in the group of animals that we sometimes call shellfish, but shellfish is a term that fishermen use, not a term that scientists use. Crabs and shrimp are called arthropods. They're in the same group of animals as insects and spiders and scorpions. Specifically, crabs and shrimp are a type of arthropod called a crustacean. They have that hard jointed skeleton. If you think about crab legs and lobster legs, they have joints, their eyes are on stalks, and they have that hard exoskeleton. But they are lumped together as shellfish quite often. All right, let's see here. Could you somehow dredge over the buried oyster shells to bring up new shells to the surface? That's challenging. In many places, those dredged areas are being maintained as dredged areas, specifically so boats can get in and out. If we were to uncover the former oyster reef areas, we might inadvertently put that material back on top of the boating channel. It's also hard to get rid of sediment on top of a thin layer of oyster shells. In fact, I didn't even know that there were certain oyster reefs in the lower Loxahatchee until a tropical storm hit our area. I spent a lot of time surveying the lower Loxahatchee for my lionfish research and my snook research, and most days I was looking at sandy bottom. And then following a tropical storm, all of a sudden I was finding these huge oyster shells in the lower estuary. And the same thing with the lower St. Lucie. They're down there. I just think it would be scientifically challenging and from an engineering perspective, challenging to uncover the old shells. It's a lot easier to recycle restaurant oyster shells, keeping them out of the landfill and adding them back into areas where we know those oysters can live. There we go. Talk about how we monitor the oyster restoration projects. I think we got to that pretty well at the end of the presentation, but that is a great question. You were reading ahead and reading our minds. Let's see, if you have a few harvestable oyster reefs, where are the Florida oysters coming from? If any of you like to eat oysters, you probably already know the answer to this. Again, I'm a big seafood eater, but I'm not an oyster eater. When you go to a restaurant and oysters show up on the menu, they're oftentimes labeled by the estuary that they come from. Oyster aficionados will tell you they can actually taste a difference between oysters that come from different bodies of water. So most commercially harvested oysters are coming from other areas. Florida does have commercial oyster harvesting going on, primarily in Northeast Florida and in the Panhandle. Famous oyster fisheries occur in the Apalachicola area. They're dealing with their own issues. The Apalachicola estuary is having problems because they're not getting enough fresh water coming from Georgia and the Florida Panhandle. So water quality is a big issue no matter where we look at oysters growing. The oyster shells we get from restaurants are being shipped to Florida from all over the country. Now, we don't want to introduce any sort of diseases or pathogens into our local waters, so we actually quarantine all of that oyster shell for a period of time before we put it back in the water. Most organizations in our area that build oyster reefs from restaurant oyster shells use a similar quarantine practice. Let's see here. This is a tough one. When you do seagrass restoration, how do you encourage the seagrass to spread? Well, actually, we don't have to do much to encourage it to spread. Seagrass grows a lot like a strawberry plant or St. Augustine grass. From a center, we get little rhizomes or stolons or shoots that grow out and spread. In fact, if you plant a little plug of seagrass in perfect conditions, within a year, it might cover an area as big as a king-size mattress. Here's our problem. In our estuary, the seagrass roots were what held the bottom into place. So when a seagrass bed dies, the bottom of the estuary gets kind of fluidized. It's not anchored down, and during storms, all that sediment washes around. If we were to just plant a little piece of seagrass in the bottom, it would wash away. Unfortunately, that's how seagrass restoration usually works. You go out to a healthy seagrass bed, you dig up a little clump, you move it to an unhealthy seagrass bed. That's not working in the Indian River Lagoon. First, because we don't have stable sediments. Second, we don't have any seagrass left. The Indian River Lagoon has lost, in all likelihood, more than 50,000 acres of seagrass in the last decade for a variety of reasons. Stay tuned for my next lecture. I'll tell you more about that when we talk about algae blooms. But basically, because FOS is able to grow seagrass in captivity from little pieces we pick up off the beach, we have a source. Now we need a technique to get that seagrass to survive when it's planted out in the wild. And this is a big part of Dr. Teiling's research. Without spoiling too many of the details, we basically create seagrass sod, big pieces of seagrass, and we're able to anchor that sod using biodegradable stakes. And by anchoring bigger pieces, we are working on techniques that allow that grass to grow using those fibrous roots and the stolons and rhizomes before it gets washed away. But I will tell you, there's an awful lot of science ahead of us and trial and error and experimentation when it comes to figuring out exactly how to best create seagrass beds in areas where the seagrass has already died off. What about muck dredging? Muck is a nickname for fine-grained organic particulate matter that settles to the bottom of the estuary. In that old book I'm reading, every mention of the bottom of the estuary and the bottom of Lake Okeechobee refers to it being firm and sandy. Today, after 100 years of urban development and runoff and agricultural practices and sod farming and all these sources, all kind of nutrients and particles have washed into our estuary. They sink to the bottom and make a layer almost of like black mayonnaise on the bottom of the estuary. That black mayonnaise is rich in nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Those nutrients are causing all kinds of problems in our estuary. In areas where this is severe, especially in the northern and central IRL, there are efforts to dredge that stuff out of the water. you know, there's some science saying that it's helpful. There's some science saying that it's not the best tool for restoring the estuary. I think depending on which scientist you talk to, the verdict is still unclear. But by dredging muck, we certainly are cleaning up the estuary. I think the bigger question is, how do we prevent new muck from forming? And that's a story for another day, but it involves reducing runoff and fixing the sewage and septic issues that the IRL is being dealt with right now. All right, my friends, it is 1:15. That was kind of, in my head, the outside end of where we wanted to wrap up today's talk. I can't thank you again for joining us. We've had I think, a really successful presentation from a technology perspective. I hope all of you have learned a lot today. You're going to get a follow-up email from us that includes my email address. If you have any questions that I have not personally addressed, I'd be happy to answer them. If it's a question outside of my wheelhouse, I will be happy to get you in touch with one of our scientists who can answer that question. Again, folks, thank you for your support. Please stay tuned. We are going to schedule some more of these lectures for the upcoming weeks, and I hope we've made your afternoon a little bit brighter. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.